Hey everyone, thank you for clicking on this video. Today I, Annika Gupta, will be your instructor and narrator to help you guide you through the process of sculpting a human heart out of clay. So let's get started. Let's first begin with the materials and tools that you'll need to complete this project. So the first thing you'll be needing is a digital kitchen scale to weigh out the amount of clay that you'll be using. I started out with about 2.3 pounds of clay, but only ended up using about 1.8 pounds. So as long as you aim for about 2 pounds of clay, you should be fine for this project. The next thing you'll want to have on hand is page 4 of your instructional guide manual, containing anatomical diagrams of the heart. You'll be referring to this page a lot during this project. Some of the tools you'll be needing are the spherical or bulbous-ended tool. This will be useful in helping to create holes or divots within the clay. Next, you'll need a slicing tool. In this case, a knife or pocket knife can do this trick. Third, you'll be needing a paintbrush. And fourth, I have here another knife tool, but I ended up not using it. The last thing you'll need is a glass of tap water, warm or cold, it doesn't really matter. Now we're ready to begin sculpting the heart. So the first thing you want to do is size up the amount of clay you'll be needing for the main part of the heart, which is about a fist or an open palm size. The easiest way to get rid of excess clay is to just break it apart with your fingers and put it on the side. We'll be using this clay later on to sculpt the major and minor blood vessels of the heart. Once you have about the size of a fist or an open palm size of clay, you're ready to begin sculpting the main body of the heart. Just to start with a more cohesive form, I'm using lots of pressure to mold my clay into a sphere. This will be helpful for our first technique called wedging. In this first technique called wedging, we'll be wrapping our fingers around the clay and placing our thumbs on top of the clay. We'll then use lots of pressure to roll the clay forward and then back to help squeeze out as many air bubbles as possible. You want the size of your clay to look like this, sort of like a rolled sponge cake. Now repeat the process of this rhythmic motion of wedging for about one more round. If your clay starts to become too cylindrical, you can take the base of your palm and beat the sides in towards the center. Once you're done wedging, begin forming your clay into a sphere. Once the clay is both wedged and in a spherical shape, you can begin sculpting the muscular portion of the heart. You can see that the heart has both a base and an apex, with the base being more rounded and the apex coming to a point. You can see that the clay is starting to look a little bit more like the heart. You can now take your thumbs and smooth over the clay just to get a more finished surface. Once you've smoothed out any major divots in the clay, you can take a piece of clay and use it as a stand to prop up your heart. This will prevent the backside of the heart from becoming flat. Putting the base aside, you can now focus on sculpting the major blood vessels of the heart, including the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, and the pulmonary arteries. To create these blood vessels, we will be using a coiling technique, technique number 2. So first take a chunk of clay and rub it in between your hands like so. The clay will slowly elongate into a rope-like structure. Using the same coiling technique, take another chunk of clay and begin forming the aortic arch of the heart. It's important to note that the aortic arch is larger in diameter when compared to the vena cava and the pulmonary arteries. so make sure that this difference is apparent when comparing the two structures. Taking your slicing tool now, begin cutting sections off of the coil to form the inferior and superior vena cava. These don't have to be exactly accurate, as you can always cut these down later on. Using my fingers, I'm just reforming the cylindrical shape of the vessels. To attach these vessels, we'll be using a third technique called the slip and scoring technique. Now you'll need your slicing tool or any pointed-ended tool, a paintbrush, and your water. Referring to the diagrams, you can see that the superior vena cava leads into the right atrium. This, of course, corresponds to the right part of the heart, so that is where we will attach this vena cava. Now, using your slicing tool, you will want to create diagonal ticks or cuts into the clay. It should look a little something like this. Now repeat this diagonal scoring technique on a section of the vessel. Taking your paintbrush, dip it in the water and dab it onto the scoring. Make sure to use light pressure to preserve your scoring cuts. When attaching two pieces together, make sure that the diagonals run in opposite directions, so that when mushed together, they create a sort of cross-hatching pattern. Using slight pressure, twist and push the pieces together to make sure that the connection is tight. Once satisfied with the connection, you can use your fingers to smooth out the edges and make sure that it is seamless. You can also use the pointed edge of your slicing tool to help you get into those small spaces. You can now slice off the excess length using your slicing tool. Make sure to support the structure using your finger. It's always helpful to remember to apply counter pressure when slicing off any section. You can use your fingers to remold the shape into a more cylindrical one. Now you can take your bulbous-ended tool and create a divot or a hole inside of the tubing. This will make it look more like a vessel. Now, using the slip and score technique, I will follow the same process to attach the inferior vena cava. When determining the placement for your scoring, make sure to note that the inferior vena cava is in line to the superior vena cava. Your scoring cuts should look a little something like this. Just like before, make sure to make diagonal cuts on the other piece as well. Then use your paintbrush to add water. Then use slight pressure to press the two pieces together and smooth down the conjoining surfaces. Just like earlier, you can again use your slicing tool to help get into those small spaces and smooth down the surface. Now we're going to move on to sculpting the ascending aorta and the aortic arch. Reaching for that thicker coil that we had sculpted previously, we will attach this right next to the superior vena cava using the slip and score technique. Since the ascending aorta features the characteristic aortic arch, you will need to elongate the column a little bit more using the coiling technique shown previously. Once long enough, you can begin sculpting the arch. Remember, you can always cut off the excess length. If you see any cracking in your clay, especially in the arch, you can use a little bit of water and smooth it out using your fingers. Using the slip and score technique, attach the ascending aorta. can now cut off the excess length if needed. Using your bulbous-ended tool, you can create a divot in the coil to represent the characteristic hollow center of a blood vessel. Moving right along, we'll now turn our attention to forming the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. Take a large chunk of clay and coil it into a thick coil. You can add a little bit of water like I did here. This just helps you to manipulate the clay a little bit more. You'll want your coil to have a decent amount of length on this because eventually we'll split this into the two separate arteries. Remember, it's always easier to cut off excess length later on. Now take your slicing tool and reference your diagram to begin the split. You'll also want to compare it to the aortic arch that you've already attached to your heart. Then you can just simply take your tool and poke it right in the clay and slice away. After the split, you'll want to reform the two separate arteries into distinct coils. The easiest way to do this is to take your thumb and your pointer finger and pinch the clay together. You can then wrap your fingers around the clay and begin forming the cylindrical shape once again. You can cut off your excess using the slicing tool. Now repeat the same process for the other pulmonary artery. Now using your tool or your fingers, you can smooth out any major deformities before attaching it using the slip and score method to the heart. Since the right pulmonary artery lies beneath the aortic arch, you want to measure out the length of the pulmonary trunk that you'll need. You can do this by placing it against the heart that you've already modeled and then approximate the amount of length that you'll need to cut off like I did here. If you check your placement, you can always readjust the length if necessary. Now attach the pulmonary trunk using the slip and score method. After pushing the two pieces together, you can use your fingers or your tool to smooth out the edges. Now referencing the diagram, you can adjust the angle of the branching pulmonary arteries. You can always cut off the excess length and then use your bulbous-ended tool to create divots in the vessel. Turning our attention to the back of the heart, we'll now be sculpting the right and left pulmonary veins. Using the coiling method, make a long and narrow cylinder. Then you can take your slicing tool and cut it into 4 equal sections. Referencing your diagram, take the back of your heart and start making scoring cuts where you would attach the left and right pulmonary veins. Following the slip and score method, go ahead and attach all 4 veins. Here I've already attached two and now I'm just smoothing down the edges. With both the right and left pulmonary veins attached, you can go ahead and cut off the excess length and then use your bulbous ended tool to create divots in the vessels. Referencing the diagrams, we can start adding in the little details. This includes the smaller cardiac veins and arteries and the distinct texture of the right and left atrium muscle. You can use water to make it easier to smooth down any surfaces. You can use your slicing tool to create diagonal cuts to represent the cardiac muscle striations. You can add excess clay onto the surface of the heart to represent the fatty tissue. You can also use your bulbous ended tool to create circular forms. Using the coiling method, make very small and thin ropes. This can be used to represent the small cardiac veins and arteries. Since this is a very small amount of clay, don't worry about slip and scoring these little details. You can add in a thin layer of clay to represent the auricle of the left atrium. Using your bulbous ended tool, you'll need to create a divot in the back of the heart to represent the inferior vena cava, which leads into the right atrium. Add on a little more clay just to make the structure a little more prominent. Then take your slicing tool, cut off the excess, and use your bulbous ended tool to recreate the hole. Now repeating the same process, add in the details to the back of the heart. You can add in any finishing details such as the ligamentum arteriosum and the muscle covering the right and left pulmonary veins on the back of the heart. And there you have it, your very own model of the human heart sculpted out of clay. Thanks for watching!